Shabbat Shalom. One of the early social graces that children learn is the custom of having the entirely meaningless conversation when we run into people of, how are you? I'm doing well, how are you? I'm also doing well. As soon as we answer the phone, when we run into someone on the street, and even when we greet people in this very sanctuary on Shabbat, we immediately start with this perfunctory ritual. And we all know that the expected and socially appropriate answer to how are you ranges from fine to great. Part of it may be about not wanting to burden other people with our problems. And part of it may be about wanting to appear perfect. We want people to say about us, she always has a smile on. He always looks presentable. She has the perfect job. He has the perfect family. She takes perfect vacations. He has a perfect life. But when we look at ourselves, we know our own imperfections all too well. We just tend to think that the best way to show up in community is to hide them. Since October 7th, however, I have noticed a verbal shift, subtle but significant. It has become socially acceptable to answer the basic "how are you" question with a bit more honesty. We're allowed to say that we're devastated, angry, fearful. We're allowed to say that we're glued to the news, refreshing Times of Israel obsessively. We're allowed to say that we stay up at night picturing the faces of the hostages, because this is a communal tragedy. We're in it together, so we're allowed to share the unmanicured imperfection of our reactions together too. This recent shift has led me to wonder whether the image of perfection we usually portray is really the best way of showing up in community. Or if it would be better, more honest, more real, more vulnerable, more authentic, to give voice to our imperfections, even when they aren't communal. The parsha we're reading this week, Truma, is all about building community literally. And our Torah reading and Haftorah reading give us two different models for what that community should look like. In the Torah reading, God gives Moses and the Israelites instructions about how to physically construct the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the temporary worship space that the Israelites will use while wandering in the desert. The Israelites are supposed to bring offerings of whatever materials they have: gold, silver, copper, dyed wool, flax, olive oil, spices, and more. Some of the biblical commentators have drawn a connection between the building of the Mishkan this week and the sin of the golden calf that is to come in a couple of weeks. The commentators say that part of why the Israelites have to bring offerings to build this worship space is so they will have somewhere to go to atone for the sin they are soon to commit. There's one midrash that gives us insight into exactly how that atonement happened. This midrash says that the Israelites actually did their teshuvah, their repentance, for the sin of the golden calf secretly. Despite having followed all of God's precise instructions to build the Mishkan, and despite their tireless effort in building, then disassembling, then carrying, then rebuilding the Mishkan, in every new location they found themselves in while in the desert, they could not bring themselves to use that communal worship space for their teshuvah. Instead, each person went into their own tent and atoned privately, secretly, perhaps not even knowing that others were doing the exact same thing in their tents. Even though their sin was a communal one, this midrash taps into the shame that each individual must have felt after such a massive betrayal of God. So much shame that they couldn't even use their beautifully constructed Mishkan for one of its main purposes, to pray for forgiveness. So much shame that they couldn't face one another or their leader Moses in their lowest moments. Our Haftorah reading, however, provides us with a very different model. We read about the construction not of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, but of the Mikdash, the temple, the permanent worship space that the Israelites build in the Holy Land under the leadership of King Solomon. In this communal center, people showed up a bit differently. Rabbi Sharon Brous of Ikar in LA wrote a recent New York Times opinion piece about what they did. The Mishnah teaches that several times a year, when thousands of Jews would make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, they would climb the steps of the Temple Mount, enter the plaza, turn right, and start walking in counterclockwise circles. Those who were in mourning or who were brokenhearted in some way would join the community for the pilgrimage, not staying alone in their separate homes. And not only did they join the community, but a special ritual was invented for comforting them. The mourners and the brokenhearted would walk up the steps, enter the plaza, turn to the left, not the right, and circle in the opposite direction. Rabbi Brous interprets that with every step these mourners and broken-hearted people took, someone would look directly into their eyes and inquire, "What happened to you? Why does your heart ache?" The person would respond and share, and then the person walking from the right would offer a blessing and say, "You are not alone." And then they would continue to walk until the next person approached. What a different norm of showing up in community than the Israelites in the desert who did their teshuvah secretly in their own tents, too ashamed to face the ones who could have provided comfort. Thousands of years later, I wonder if perhaps we haven't fully moved from the Mishkan tabernacle model to the Mikdash temple model. We still feel that shame. We still hide the parts of our lives that we fear others would judge unfavorably. We would rather be seen as perfect than receive support for that which is imperfect. When I look out at our community, I know that many people have experienced personal struggles, the kinds we don't often share publicly. I know that there are people having marital issues, people who were laid off at work, people who had a miscarriage, people having financial struggles, people who have stopped speaking to their parents, people who received a bad diagnosis, people whose children are struggling in school, people whose lives aren't going exactly as they had planned. Isn't that all of us? Who here can honestly say that every aspect of their life has worked out exactly as they'd hoped and dreamed? These are the kinds of issues we usually deal with by going into our own metaphorical tents to cope privately, emerging publicly only when we can paste on a big, perfect smile. But how much stronger of a community could the desert wandering Israelites have been if they had done their teshuvah together in the Mishkan, faced their shame alongside one another? And how much stronger of a community could we be if we allowed the unmanicured versions of ourselves to be seen? So let me say this unequivocally. Here at Park Avenue Synagogue, it's okay to say you're not okay. It's okay to share the things that make us imperfect. It's okay to be real and flawed and hurting. We will still love you and accept you. In fact, we might even love you more because we'll know the whole you. And you'll make everyone else feel like we can be ourselves too. In the end, the fundamental purpose behind every small architectural detail of the Mishkan found in this week's Parsha can be boiled down to one verse. Ve'asu li mikdash v'shachanti betocham. God says, "Make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell among you." We are to create a sacred space, and then God will join us in it. The word for that sacred space, mishkan, is the noun that comes from God's request, vishachanti, I will dwell among them. The very definition of a sanctuary is not about whether it's permanent or impermanent, a tabernacle or a temple. It's not about the objects that make up the mishkan. It's about the space within, the space that makes room for holiness, and what we do in that space. There are infinitely many ways that we can create space for holiness. One of them we can learn from temple times, making space for ourselves and one another to show up as our flawed, hurting, brokenhearted, real selves. Shabbat Shalom.